I want you to think back to the first time you were ever introduced to Kirby. I have a feeling that for many of you, those memories might include messing around with different animal buddies, mixing and matching different combat combinations, exploring an interconnected mirror world, or perhaps traversing through all of Dreamland in a giant mech suit. My point being, Kirby is absolutely no stranger to playing around with different concepts. And of the millions of other reasons why I love this series, that is admittedly a pretty big one. This series isn't afraid to innovate. It's not afraid to explore an idea and have a mechanic that shakes things up every now and again. But even still, no matter which game it is, the series not even for a second ever lost sight of its appeal and why we're all here. The kinetic gameplay, the brilliant platforming, the cozy and comforting atmosphere, and the absolutely superb copyability system are the things that defined Kirby for almost 3 decades. And those are the things that people will always associate with this franchise and why it's so great. But with that being said, my first Kirby game was the one where next to none of that was present. I remember my first experience with this series pretty vividly. I was downstairs on my Wii, probably playing Mario Kart or Wii Sports with a neighborhood friend of mine, when all of a sudden I heard footsteps thumping from the stairs, and from the balcony of the steps I heard one of my sisters shout, "Get off the Wii right now!" I didn't really know why she reacted like that, but I also wasn't in the mood of being spanked that day, so I just let her have this one. A few hours would go by, and when I booted up the console again, I was greeted with a channel on the menu called Kirby's Epic Yarn. 6-year-old average Joe had next to no idea what any of those words even meant, but even as a 6-year-old, he was absolutely hungry for content. So he booted the game up for the first time, and within minutes of playing the first stage, he was actually enjoying himself. Controls were a lot more different than he was used to, and he found it very weird that there were no Goombas to stomp on. But despite that, he grew to end up loving what he was currently playing. He loved it so much that when his sister would eventually come back to play it again, he actually offered to play it with her. And then his other siblings would watch them play, and then they would also get the urge to try it out. And before any of them knew it, they would all end up connecting and bonding over this game in such a strong way. I have so many fond memories with this game, if you couldn't already tell. Whether it be playing it with my family or even by myself, those are moments that I will always cherish and will never ever forget. But man, like, as much as it pains me to say this, that was almost 13 years ago. And now, in 2023, when the people of the Wii generation should be feeling a rush of remnants and nostalgia for it, I barely ever hear anyone bring it up. Well, why? It couldn't have been the fact that the game itself was bad. It's a Kirby game for one thing, and secondly, this game in particular was received incredibly well upon its release. It also couldn't have been poor sales because, from what I was able to find, this game pushed quite a few units, so what could have possibly happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. Approximately 1 year later, in 2011, another more traditional style of Kirby game hit the scene, and people liked it so much more. This is the game that people remember more fondly. This is the game that people tend to associate more with Kirby. This is the game that only just recently received a fully blown remaster for Nintendo's shiny new system. I mean, in the interest of fairness, Epic Yarn did also get a re-release for a system that was on life support. It was alright, but between the new remaster and the insanely positive reception that Return to Dreamland would get over the last decade, I would feel not necessarily mad, but just kinda distant from all the hype. It's not because of the fact that I hated the game, I didn't even own it back in the day, and it's also not because I hated the fact that it existed. In the grand scheme of things, a game like this definitely needed to happen for multiple reasons that I'll delve further into. But beyond everything else, it just seemed like, to me at least, that everyone simply forgot about Epic Yarn. And I took offense to that. Nearly my entire family took offense to that. And while I'm happy that the Return to Dreamland remaster is good and all, I just want to dedicate these next couple of minutes to explain just why this game is such a relic to me, to my siblings, and that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds and geeks, and all my queer and non-binary peeps, this is Kirby's Epic Yarn. Now, regardless if you're someone who's new to the series or a longtime fan, just looking at footage of this game, you might probably be asking yourself a lot of really good questions. What happened to Kirby? Is he okay? Is this even Dreamland? Who is this doofus? What is with this game? Well, the answer to about half of those questions lies within the plot. It isn't anything all that deep. Kirby stumbles upon this weird sorcerer-looking guy who just so happens to be hiding in a bush with this tomato on his head for seemingly no reason. So when Kirby sees it and attempts to inhale it, it reveals said sorcerer, and then he gets drawn into this sock that was around the sorcerer's neck, and that's where this yarn world takes place in, I'm guessing. I don't know, this whole premise is pretty whack. I get that they're trying to be simple, it is a Kirby game that we're talking about here, but a lot of these things about the plot just seem very convenient and disjointed, if that makes any sense. But going completely off topic, this is the first and to my knowledge the only time in the series where this game actually comes equipped with a narrator, which makes me feel all warm and cozy and actually kind of reminds me of Thomas the Tank Engine, for those of you who watched that show as a kid. It's similar to that, minus the, But anyhow, after one pretty brief tutorial segment, Kirby eventually stumbles upon this blue yarn boy who's just being absolutely tormented by damn near everything. He actually saves him a couple of times during the first act. However, after killing this yarn abomination, a piece of magic yarn swirls above the two of them. So the yarn boy, who properly introduces himself as Prince Fluff, explains that yes, you are indeed in a completely different world. Patchland, as it were. And the yin yarn person that you encountered earlier is trying to break up all the pieces of Patchland, and the only way to bring everything back together is with this swirly magic yarn thingamajig. So, Kirby and Prince Fluff set out to do exactly that. With all that information, it definitely does do a better job at providing some sort of context for the adventure. But, like most other games in this series, it's nothing all that complicated. So, as previously mentioned, this game is pretty widely considered as the black sheep of the entire franchise, much to the shock of 6-year-old average Joe. Just to name a few differences, you can no longer float, you can no longer do the inhale move simply because your body is completely gone, and the part that really got people off guard was the fact that copy abilities are completely absent. Obviously at the time I had nothing to compare it to, but by 2010, those were things that became inseparable from the series' core gameplay loop. Sucking up enemies, getting their powers, using their powers for combat. That was largely what people played these games for. So when a game like this comes around and gets rid of a lot of those things, yeah, I can definitely see how some people could feel a bit shaky. Actually, when viewed under that lens, the acclaim that Return to Dreamland got makes a lot more sense. Especially when you take into consideration that the last console entry was released all the way back on the N64. Just having a new, traditional Kirby game on your new Nintendo console was very attractive. And seeing that the Wii tended to draw in a lot of casual people, Return to Dreamland acted as the perfect game to start with when looking to see if this franchise is for you. In contrast, however, Epic Yarn plays and controls so differently that, upon further inspection, was probably one of the worst first impressions of this series. It's funny, because when I played a quote-unquote real Kirby game for the first time, it was the weirdest moment because it was such an intense contrast from the gameplay style that I was used to. But for as much as I'm contrasting Epic Yarn with the rest of the series, there are still certain elements of the gameplay that don't necessarily remain intact, but have been tweaked and readjusted a bit. A lot of Kirby's moves have been yarnified, for lack of a better term. What I mean by that is that Kirby can still run and jump like he always has, but seeing that he's made of yarn this time around, he could transform into different things that act as substitutes for running and jumping, some of which vaguely resemble copy abilities they had in the past. For attacking, he has this little lasso move, which could be used to pull stuff towards you, swirl things around you, swing on things above you, mercilessly pull your enemies apart limb from limb, and use enemies as projectiles and yeet them at other unsuspecting objects. I feel like that's the only thing you can really do in this game that feels somewhat Kirby-like, and even still, when looked at in the grand scheme of the series, we've essentially gone back to Dreamland 1 in terms of mechanics. And while I normally kinda get annoyed when a game takes away a previously established mechanic, I can excuse it in this game for two reasons. For one, the entire game is designed around the limited moveset, so it never really feels unfair. And two, I can only get so mad at these controls if it weren't for how stupid detailed they are. The amount of animation that literally all these moves have drives me insane. Everything moves together in such a smooth and seamless manner, and everything squashes and stretches in such an intense way. Whenever I jump, I could feel the weight of Kirby passing through my hands. That was a very weird description, but my point being, there's just so much polish and effort into making these controls flow so well. Now, it is with its flaws. Given the amount of detail, it can make moving around feel a bit sluggish and hard to control at some points, especially while transforming into that car. But again, I'm willing to excuse it simply because moving around in this game feels really, really good. But trust me, the detail, the polish, and the sheer creativity of the controls can be seen literally all over this thing. Because I'm just gonna come out and say it, Epic Yarn is hands down the most imaginative platformer I have ever played in my entire life. Now, Kirby games generally aren't the most complicated when it comes to their level design. There's still obviously a lot of platforming going on here, but their more combat-focused gameplay and light use of puzzle solving and exploration seem to be what these games are most remembered for. This is yet another area that Epic Yarn differs in, because the levels in this game tend to focus on combat way less, to the point where you can't even die, like, at all. You can still get hit by stuff, but you don't take any damage, there's not a health bar, and instead you lose a bunch of these beads. Why would anyone care about this? Well, because these levels are generally pretty big and have a much higher emphasis on exploration this time around. You could find all kinds of things within these areas, some of which can be used as customization for Kirby's apartment. Yes, that is a real thing that you could actually do, and the beads are mostly here to incentivize you to explore these levels as much as possible, given the fact that they're all over the place, and the more of them you get, the higher rank you'll obtain at the end of the level. I mean, I think they're pretty cool additions, but looking at all these elements in the context of the rest of the series, again, I can still see why some wouldn't necessarily be a fan. But man, like, as objective as I'm trying to be here, I simply can't help but absolutely adore literally every level in this game. Aside from like one or two of the space levels, I can confidently say that I had a pleasant time within each and every single one of these areas. And I'm going to be 100% blunt when I say this. The reason for why that is because of how beautifully the aesthetics and presentation is weaved into their design. Every single thing in this game, every enemy, every stage hazard, everything you pull and interact with, even the ground that you are standing on, is made out of arts and crafts. Everything. The yarn aesthetic is not for show. There is so much detail within literally everything going on within these levels. All obstacles and hazards are placed in very smart and clever ways, but it really does take a game as creative as this one to go the extra mile and make those obstacles feel natural and make total sense within the context of the world. Everything feels interconnected and has such a great sense of belonging and purpose to it. And it's that element of cohesion that allows a lot of these levels to really hit hard. Now, in general, Epic Yarn takes a lot more pages from a traditional platformer, And because of that, it allows these devs to really stretch their creative muscles, to really play around with all these different ideas and concepts that normally wouldn't fly in any other Kirby game. They just have so many interesting set pieces, are filled with so much stuff to find, they're just beaming with so much imagination. And while we're on the subject of being imaginative, I briefly want to mention something. So if you remember towards the start of this video, I mentioned that the copy abilities were completely absent, and while that is still true, the concept of Kirby getting new abilities hasn't really gone anywhere. There are these little yellow sticker things you can peel off within the stages, and while Kirby can already transform into a whole bunch of things naturally just his base moveset, these stickers take it a step further. They feature transformations that more so act as separate sections of a level, often come equipped with their own different control style. Admittedly, they are pretty one-note and simplistic when you do really analyze them, but that says nothing about just how much fun these sections are. Shooting missiles with a tank, digging through cotton as a mole, exploring the deep dark sea as a shark, drawing tracks as a train. Okay, admittedly not all of them are perfect, but my point being, these sections not only add a lot of variety to the game, but again, they're just fun. They're flashy, they're over the top, and oftentimes they come with very cool set pieces of their own. And again, the charm that the yarnified aesthetic adds to these sections truly does make them 10 times better. Like, this bears repeating into dust, but the yarn aesthetic is not for show. This entire aesthetic has done nothing but enhance and further amplify the general vibe of the game. The devs realized the potential that the yarn aesthetic could bring to a platformer like this, and they made sure that absolutely none of it went to waste. The style, the presentation, and most importantly the atmosphere that this game creates is simply top-notch. However, when talking about how this game creates the tone and vibe that it does, we have to look at arguably one of the best things about the game, its soundtrack. I could be entirely wrong on this, but Epic Yarn might just be the only game in the series that runs with a musical theme. Or at least it feels like it does. Something about the soundtrack manages to give off a very soft, chill, and I know it's easy for me to say, but nostalgic vibe. And I think the main source of that has to do with the instruments that they use to make it. The bouncy synth-based melodies are kept to a minimum here, and instead replaced with a whole bunch of piano. This OST is almost exclusively piano-centered, with nearly every song featuring it in some way. But I just love the fact that it's used to add a nice flavor to a lot of these songs, and these composers did such an impressive job at making it have so much versatility, and be able to portray feelings of excitement, wonder, and adventure without ever feeling too samey or repetitive. It's a surefire way to relieve any stress, or just calm me down, but it also never fails to just take me back. The nostalgia is very heavy with this one. Granted, it'd be weird if it wasn't. With a game that looks like this, has such a relaxing atmosphere, it's just very easy to feel sentimental whenever I hear one of those tunes and just reminisce back to when I first heard them as a 6-year-old, when time felt so much shorter, when life was just so much simpler, when I didn't feel like mentally jumping off a bridge every 10 seconds and... Oh, sorry, I got a bit sidetracked there. But anyways, I've kind of been neglecting the story a little bit. Throughout the adventure, you'll actually face off against some oddly familiar faces, as apparently, Kirby isn't the only Dreamlandian in this world. As you've no doubt seen from the footage, a lot of the enemies from Dreamland are here, which is strange, but weirdly enough, Deity and Meta Knight are also in this world. Kirby wasn't the only person who Yin Yarn was picking on. And before anyone really knew it, most of Dreamland itself had been turned into Yarn. And again, this is one of those things that completely flew over my head as a kid that I absolutely adore now, because this essentially means that you get to waltz through a Yarnified version of your home world. All these familiar locales, all these recognizable landmarks, all these cute little enemies and bosses that are so used to seeing have all fallen under the corruption of Yin Yarn's magic. And that's really cool. I mean, if you could even consider this a corruption, that is. You wanna know what else that flew past my head as a kid? the music that plays here. Quite a bit of the songs from some of the previous games return in Epic Yarn's sound font, and they did a really good job in making them fit in nice and snugly with the rest of the music. Granted, the last time that I heard these songs was like literally 2013, so just hearing music that I now know are Yarnified remixes is as eye-openingly cool as it is trippy. But after all that, you finally get to take the fight to Yin Yarn himself in an epic climactic battle where the fate of both worlds is currently at stake. And what does this battle look like? How does Yin Yarn prove himself as being a foreboding and intimidating foe? By crawling off to the side and recreating the other bosses to fight you for him. Okay, that sounds a lot worse than it actually is. The fight itself still does play like a boss rush, and Yin Yarn himself takes a bit of a backseat. But I still think that the battle as a whole is pretty creative, all things considered. It's just a shame that for the final battle, it's pretty whatever. And keep in mind, this is a series where the final bosses are some of the most insane that I've ever seen in a platformer. However, Mr. Yin Yarn isn't quite done yet, as with the last piece of the Swirly Yarn restored, he comes back at the last minute and uses it to create, that. Kirby takes this as an opportunity to transform one final time, thanks to Manonite, and now the real final battle begins. And you just spam A a bunch of times until you win. That's literally all you do. It's a spectacle for sure, and it definitely felt very energizing to completely pummel this guy in the face as a kid, but there is next to no actual substance. But with that, Yin Yarn equals dead, and all of Patch and Dreamland is finally saved. Kirby has one final exchange with Prince Fluff. Both are kind of sad that their time together came to an end so quickly, but Fluff guarantees him that he'll always be open for him to visit Patchland whenever he pleases, as long as he keeps and remembers that magic sock. And seeing that we've never seen or heard from Prince Fluff since, yeah, I think he lost it. Oh, Kirby. I'm mindful that to a good amount of you, this game may not necessarily fit within your taste. I'm also mindful that to a good amount of you, this game might just be right up your alley and look just as good as I've been saying that it is. However, no matter how much I've tried to hammer in this point into this video, I still don't think that any of those two groups of people could truly understand just how much this game means to me. I'm only speaking for myself when I say this, but Epic Yarn is the embodiment of genuine childhood nostalgia. Very few games manage to get me emotional every single time I go back to it, especially during the footage gathering process. There were multiple points in the playthroughs where I found myself holding back tears. These worlds, these animations, these songs I haven't heard in such a long time. And whenever I hop back into Patchland, all of those things just, again, take me back. Take me back to those moments where I first heard these piano-filled instrumentals. Take me back to my older sister yelling at me for getting lost in this maze level. Take me back to when I beat the final boss for the first time. When I beat a video game for the first time. I know this may be the easiest game in existence, but still, all of those moments, all those memories, it's just... But man, like, the crazy part is that, especially now when I have most of the series under my belt, these feelings have only ever gotten stronger. That's not commenting on the quality of the games at all. I mean, even at the time, I found something genuinely to enjoy about how most of these games play. But over the years, I've started to come to this glaring realization that we probably may not ever see a Kirby game like this one ever again. There'll probably never be a game that's as innovative, as imaginative, and as full of heart and soul and passion and sheer creativity as this game right here. Now, Kirby games have had a habit of switching developers from game to game, but this remains to this day the only Kirby game to be developed by the people over at Goodfeel. And what they managed to bring to this franchise was absolutely powerful. And dude, like, I've been gushing about this game from top to bottom, But that's not even including the amount of small little details and little touches that were added to this game seemingly just for the sake of it. Things like the animations in the hub world, how adorable and precious a lot of these Waddle Dees can be, and I know this is gonna sound extremely nerdy, but the sound design and the sound effects I just love. Everything sounds so distinctly soft and gentle, which adds so much to that cozy vibe that's present throughout the entire game. God, at this point I might as well just be rambling. But I mean, we all have those games in our lives, right? We all have games that hold so much meaning to us, that represents a lot of different things to us, and no matter how many times you try to express those feelings and get those thoughts off of your chest, it just never seems like it's enough. And if I haven't already made it clear, this is definitely one of those games for me, and I tend to be very hard on myself for making sure I do games like it justice. It's actually part of the reason why this 20-ish minute long video took so long to come out, because aside from other factors, I just couldn't gather the words that accurately express just how much I adore this video game. It's by far my favorite game in the Kirby series and just one of my all-time favorites, period. I know you probably don't feel the same way, and that's okay, but above everything else, I hope you now have an understanding for the things that this game does to be the best Kirby game that no one talks about.